I would like to welcome the friends who are watching us from this room, but also online. I would like to thank the Hellenic American Chamber of Commerce for giving us the opportunity to discuss about the developments in the international tax environment and how these developments are expected to impact the economic activity in the country. And of course, could we have a more competent person to hold this discussion than Ms. Athena Kalyva, who has experience in Brussels? He has taken part in the permanent delegations, both in Greece and Cyprus, and she has also served in the European Commission. So let us all welcome the Secretary General for Tax Policy and Public Property, Ms. Athena Kalyva. Welcome, Ms. Kalyva. Thank you very much. It is an honor to be here today, and I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation and for giving us the opportunity to exchange views on all these developments that are taking place internationally and which, of course, have an impact on our country. It is our pleasure. Now, before we proceed to the discussion of the topics, I would like to ask you, you are head of a newly established body of the Ministry of Finance. Why has this been this reorganization, and which are the basic competences of the General Secretariat for Tax Policy and Public Property? Thank you very much for the question. Indeed, the body which I'm heading is newly established. Two secretariats have merged. The one pre-existed. I'm talking about the Secretariat for Public Property, and the second one is the newly established. That was decided in the context of the effective state. Now, why was this necessary? We all know that during the last 20 years, there had been several efforts aiming at changing the context in which the tax policy was implemented. Many often we could see that the Ministry of Finance was independent. Other times the Ministry of Finance was operating in the context of the Ministry of Economy. In other words, what did we have in the past? We had the framework that pertained to the revenues management, but also the implementation of tax policy, which was once undertaken by the Ministry of Finance, other times by the two ministries together, Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Economy. During the financial crisis, many proposals were submitted based on the best practices in order to see how we could make the tax policy more effective, but also to ensure the best management of revenues. We all know that tax policy is a necessity, since without it, there can be no public revenues and there can be no public cohesion. So in order to implement successful tax policy and have an effective management of public revenues, we propose the development of the independent authority, which will be competent for the management of revenues and for the implementation of tax policy. And the implementation of tax policy was assigned to the newly established General Secretariat for Tax Policy, which I have the honor to head. And of course, in the context of the effective state, this Secretariat had to be under the supervision of the Ministry of Finance in order to ensure that we would have a successful implementation of tax policy and ensure that the management of revenues would be done by an independent authority. This is the example of many European countries, but also the United States. It is quite an advanced model, but I believe that it is effective. So we could say that the General Secretary has an extrovert role. And this brings me to the first question I want to ask you. The question pertains to the agreement of the 6th of October in the context of the OECD. There was this important agreement regarding the development of a new tax framework for multinational companies, given that predictability is one of the most important factors to attract investments. And given that the country, Greece, ratified this agreement, what does Greece expect to get from this agreement? Thank you very much for the question. Indeed, the agreement was indeed very important. We should not forget that the rules on the corporate tax, the basic rules, were established in the 1920s. Of course, some have been modernized, but their main structure dates back to the 20s. And some of the previous speakers talked about the permanent residence, principle, which was the totem. You had the permanent residence. All the profits were connected to the permanent residence without any provision for the development of business models, digitalization that is very dynamic now. So there was this necessity to update the rules. We all know that the United States never agreed to such a change of the global system. In 2016, very slowly it started adopting the PEPs. This was the major step that was made. And then after the change of government in the United States, we had the successful opportunity to revisit this issue and in October have this agreement, which aims at putting an end to the race to the bottom and to the nominal and effective tax rates. It aims at developing a fair global system, and the principles of this system will be based on transparency and justice. Of course, one could ask why didn't the European Union proceed more dynamically? A union that has 27 members, a union that could impose on European level a similar agreement. The European Union actually made some steps. It drafted similar directives with regard to the definition of permanent residence, taking into account the digital development and all the other legislative frameworks that would be valid at European level. However, and very wisely so, taking into account the competition that would emerge for the European businesses, it supported this agreement at the level of OECD, and this is why we are here today with this agreement. Allow me to say that this agreement has two pillars. The only thing is that it's complicated in terms of implementation. The first pillar refers to the allocation of tax rights, and the second to the minimum tax rate. The first pillar, of course, always has as a base the profitability criterion. It refers to multinationals that have over $20 billion turnover, whereas the second pillar refers only to the turnover without taking into account the profitability, which is included in the first pillar. The agreement on minimum tax rate is 15%, which is, of course, the result of a compromise. And we should also keep in mind that 137 countries have ratified this agreement. So you understand the importance of this agreement for international competition. I said that it is simple in theory, simple in understanding, but rather complicated in implementing. Of course, there will be some technical groups that will be responsible for the implementation. Now, some initial researches that have been conducted by the International Observatory have shown that the results to be expected are positive and encouraging. However, we will see in reality whether these estimates and forecasts will be realized. For our country, we are talking about 2.1 billion regarding the corporate taxation, which after 10 years, with the exemptions and with the readjustment of the implementation context, is reduced to 1.4 billion. However, at the moment, it is not important to focus only on the size of the benefit, because everything will depend on the implementation. What is important is that at political level, we do have this agreement and that the trend is positive. For me, it's very important the fact that Greece is in the table of global discussions. And this is a new development, we could say, a development of the recent years. And those of us who are active in the country need to make the most of it. Now I would like to talk about a different issue that shows this change of mentality of public administration. The country, in a rather unstable global environment, makes leaps in terms of economic growth. On the other hand, the deficits of competitiveness and investments continue to be a problem. Of course, there have been some positive developments, but the problem remains. In this environment, the Ministry of Finance made some announcements 2 weeks ago about tax incentives aiming at attracting investors and human resources in the country. Do you believe that Greece can become a taxation residence for groups of people like the digital nomads? Of course. And we didn't announce our intention to introduce tax incentives. We have introduced them in practice. We followed a holistic approach. We had seen that the tax rates in the European Union didn't have large margins of change. So that is why we proceeded to the taxation of physical persons. And since I have experience in the public administration and I know how difficult it is for someone to become tax resident of Greece or even to change tax residence, I know that these new developments are in the right direction. Now, enjoying the trust of the Greek state, and I would like to thank the leadership of the Ministry of Finance for showing me this trust, I would prefer to have a different approach. I have always believed, since I have studied all the national reform programs, that in order for a reform to be successful, you need to have ownership of it, to have the time to implement it, and a body responsible for its implementation. Taking into account all the taxation policies that I had examined, I wanted to focus on those that would increase the GDP. In other words, policies that would impact the growth rate of GDP through employment and investment. So, introducing these two incentives, we have reached an income tax for investors. We introduced for the very first time the non-dom for investors. Anyone who invests over 500,000 euros in a 3 years' time can change the tax residence. And of course, for all revenues coming from abroad, he can pay 100,000 euros and be done. And it was a great pleasure to hear yesterday that many people perceive this reform as unprecedented, but at the same time, others say that these reforms are addressed to high net worth individuals. The amount that was determined, the threshold that we have set, was done in purpose because we have a more extrovert, if you like, approach. We are not limited in our microcosm. Now, with regard to silver economy, we made the most of it and we introduced the beneficial tax regime. I don't like the word regime, but still I need to use it, where with a tax rate of 7%, we invite residents of abroad to change their tax residence. The third is the reply we give to brain drain. The third incentive, the 5C, is referring to the brain drain, where we're going to have beneficial treatment of the 50% of the taxable income of those who want to come back to Greece. And again, the response has been more than positive. During the first year of implementation, we have received over 1,000 applications. So you understand how warmly they have welcomed this incentive. And the framework is flexible for the digital nomads that you mentioned. Of course, many people say that being digital means that they don't have the obligation to pay. This is not true. You need to have a tax residence somewhere. And moreover, some time ago, we established the special purpose companies, the so-called family offices. The well-known family offices, and I'm using the description well-known because a lot of discussion has been held on these. So we are soon to complete the secondary legislation with regard to family offices. In order for you to understand, we established new rules for the taxation of family offices on the basis of the expenses. They need to make 1 million expenses in order to be able to be called family offices. So you understand how much income we can have in Greece from family offices, which until recently were operating in tax havens. Now, all these regimes and all the incentives given were given with full transparency, with harmonious cooperation with other member states without damaging tax competition. All this, on the contrary, allowed Greece to have a place on the taxation map. This is the required, actually. And I'm sure that we will get very positive results. Now, let's talk about the European framework and the European directives that are under revision, starting with the very important directive for the future of all of us. And I'm talking about the directive on energy, which was announced in the context of the Fit for 55 program. I would like to ask you, many people actually expressed hesitation with regard to these ambitious measures announced by the European Union. And many people talked about the deficit of competition among the European member states. Do you believe that this is a risk that is real? And how would you relate this to the works of the COP26 works that took place last year in Glasgow? You mentioned Fit for 55, which is actually the result of the Paris Agreement. It pertains to the Europe that we want to have in the future. What we want is for Europe to be environmentally neutral by 2030, which of course entails a cost. All these actions refer not only to tax issues. There are 12 actions in the Fit for 55. I would like to focus, however, on the tax part. Indeed, a large part refers to taxation. The revision of energy tax is an old issue. In 2012, 2013, when Cyprus has the presidency, many efforts were made to revise it. However, the modernization wasn't achieved. Modernization that would allow the incorporation of criteria that would allow the taxation systems to contribute to combating climate change. However, back then we didn't manage to get a compromise, which I would like to remind you requires consensus. We didn't get the compromise because Poland had objections. Right now, of course, the situation is different. The Commission made the proposal, which is undoubtedly very ambitious. It requires a lot of attention since competitiveness is also included in the whole stake. And as we said, it is always better when it comes to the effectiveness of these measures to make an effort and to have similar actions at global level. It's not enough to have these actions at European level when you have countries in the East, I don't need to name them, that are not only polluters, but they have become very damaging to the environment. Generally speaking, this agreement is balanced. However, there are some elements that need to get our attention. The Greek state needs to examine all these issues in detail. Of course, we were expecting all things to happen. We knew what were the evaluations that had been made. So after the ECOFIN meeting, and after a strong battle given by member states, along with Greece, of course, we included in the conclusions the requirement to assess the cost that these actions will incur on specific member states. In other words, to take into account the framework of competition. Greece, given its insular character, is a very special case. insularity is an asset, but the reality is that the abolition of exemptions that is provided for by the directive will increase the cost. So we need to find some countermeasures. You can't accept the directive with consensus, and then if you talk about direct subsidy, this is direct subsidy is immediate support. All these actions will have a serious effect on different sectors. The agricultural sector will be influenced, and mind you, it will not be the only one. The transport sector will also be influenced. We also have the border adjustment mechanism for carbon, which is, again, related to cross-border costs pertaining to products that are exchanged between countries. However, the way that it's going to be implemented, I believe, will be the right one. The European Commission has followed a very careful approach, and it has followed the principles of the ETS system. And moreover, given that we are an exporting countries of these specific products, we need to take into account the competition, and we need to find solutions through this agreement. We could talk for hours about all these issues. However, we don't have much time. We had 10 minutes, and we would like to thank the organizing committee for this time. Now, another important issue. I'm talking about the directive on tobacco products. What we see is Europe and its policies being progressive and pushing whole industries into the transformation process. Car industry, for example. Do you believe that in this directive there will be a similar approach, or we're going to have a more different one, since the tobacco industry is a rather ambiguous one? Look, the European Union needs to strike a balance. On the one hand, to support policies for the protection of public health, and on the other, to preserve the industry of certain member states, including tobacco industry and agricultural sectors. So the European Union needs to find the balance between these two. It needs to support transition. You know very well the innovative businesses. I mean, you have developed new products. Every day you introduce something new that is less damaging to the public health. You have made very important efforts in that direction. I hope, of course, that we could have the possibility to live in a world where nobody would smoke. But I understand your role, I understand what you do and how you contribute to the growth of Greek economy. Allow me to interrupt, but we have 5 seconds. Could you please make one final intervention? Leave a message if you like. The message is that the Ministry of Finance keeps track of all international developments. The Minister and we in the General Secretariat constantly keep track of the developments and constantly take part in discussions that pertain to all these issues. And we do that not just to take part in the discussion, but in order to protect the Greek interests and the economy of our country. Thank you very much for the discussion. Thank you.